Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the first Pendragon Roundtable. Pendragon Roundtable, this is going to be something which happens every month. It's going to be a bunch of us who you will get to know over the coming months, discussing things that we want to discuss, interesting things, interesting books, interesting topics, things which we can just have a nice kind of fireside chat about and go down the rabbit holes. And tonight I have with me three distinguished gentlemen. I have Rupert August, I have AR Green, and I have James. Hello, chaps. How are you all doing?
Evening
Hello,
all.
very good.
Well,
Hello,
it is
doing
good
well.
to have you here. And our theme tonight is a classic in many ways. It's something which probably all of us and all of you who are watching this have heard of, even if we've never read the books or watched the films. It is Dracula by Bram Stoker, a novel written in 1897. And since that point, it has gone on to influence pop culture in many great ways, in terrible ways. The idea of the vampire percolating in our minds as a monster which threatens us. But we kind of want to go back to the original source material here, the Victorian novel, and explore something about it, because I don't know about you guys, but when I first read this as a teenager in GCSEs, our teacher thought this would be something which would interest a group of high school boys rather than Pride and Prejudice will read Dracula. And she was right. We loved all the kind of gory aspects and the horror and this monster coming to drink the blood of his victims. But having reread it recently, I was struck by how the themes or the ideas in Dracula are actually a lot more complex and richer and challenging than the surface level kind of vampire story might suggest. But I mean, is that your experience of it?
Yeah, I think I'd agree. I've just read it recently, actually, for the first time. It was the first time I've read it. But there's some very heavy, weighty topics within it. I think the religious aspects of the book is one thing that particularly interested us, because it kind of, especially within modernity and within most film adaptations, gets glossed over to some degree. It's just the wave across at the vampire, it gets scared and then runs away. And that's the extent of like the religious aspect of it that they really cover in films. Whereas in the book, it's much, much deeper.
Yeah, I'm coming at this from quite a different angle from AR Green. This is my second time reading it, and like Nathan, I read it before with very, very different eyes from how I'm looking at it now. Very, very different indeed. And a lot of the themes that went over my head then make complete sense now, and a lot of the actions the characters take, which didn't make any sense to me back in my youth, make absolute sense now, having come across people like Jonathan Harker in my life, and having known them and what they like and what they're like and how they react to things. Now someone like him makes a lot more sense than before.
Yeah, I think I'm in much the same boat as Green, in that I've only had the one pass at it, and relatively recently, so I don't have that kind of 2 point of comparison. But yeah, I mean, going into it with some amount of opinion and my thoughts on the world already partly formed, there's kind of some interesting things in there that, I don't know. It almost. I think this is not a new take, but it almost comes across in some places just like a takedown of a lot of trappings of aristocracy in general. In that it kind of tries to smear a lot of those elements, some of which come across obviously a lot more forthrightly than others. But I think even now the traditional view of the vampire is kind of still holding some of that baggage of complying by the same rules, which almost in some places were kind of I would perhaps argue were kind of like a takedown of certain aristocratic mores and traditions, and like how they would conduct themselves.
Yeah, I get where you come from with that. I think that is quite an interesting aspect of it. Just the idea that it's almost a progressive, the sort of first iteration of progressive deconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, not the first example of it by far, but
Yeah, well,
yeah,
earlier
one
one,
such.
especially compared to our modern era.
Yeah. Well, I mean, arguably going all the way back to Don Quixote, there's that same like line running through
Yeah,
parts of fiction, but yeah. I mean, just to take a few of the things that come off the top of my head, the style of manners, the particular kind of code of conduct that Dracula holds himself to, especially back home. Whilst I don't know, the one scene that comes to mind is presenting. I think it was Jonathan Harker with a choice of whether to leave or not, and the door is thrown wide open. But in practice, the choice it's a false choice because at the door there are vicious wolves. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that is an interesting aspect. But then there's also
the
things that are
nocturnal. The nocturnal aspect as well is another one, because I mean, obviously, we don't really. It's not really talked about as much now as part of aristocratic lifestyle, but they used to live a lot more at night and were very late risers and things like that. So I think people at the time probably would have recognised that. But sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say there is things that are directly almost in contrast to that in terms of our modernist attitudes and modernist perceptions towards things. Like, specifically when I mentioned religion, one of the things that really interested us was you've got the part where Mina's been bitten and she's infected with the vampiric disease almost. And the group gathers around and has a discussion, and they, without even second thought, basically say, like, yeah, if it gets too bad, we're just going to kill her because her immortal soul is way more important than her physical being. And there was no sort of pushback against it. It was just accepted as, yeah, that's what's going to have to happen. Which,
Yeah.
yeah, sorry, go on.
Well, it strikes me you could summarize that aspect of the story as, what was Christ's words? Do not fear that which can kill the body, but that which can kill the soul. And this, because one of the effects of a vampire's bite, right? Because in a lot of literature, it's like, oh, you're bitten by a vampire, you're going to die. That's the worst thing. It's going to take your blood, and this is a violation of your being, because blood in ancient thought is tied to life. It carries the vital spirits which make you alive. So it's stealing your soul, as it were. But what happens in Dracula is if you're bitten, you will become a vampire after death yourself and be trapped in this kind of cursed state. And so a large part of the battle isn't just about, okay, Mina can die and that'll be okay. No, actually, she'll become like Dracula, bound for eternity in this sort of cursed paralysis of being a monster with no escape from it. So it very much is about the soul rather than just mere material biological life, as it were.
It seems to me like when Mina faces that, she faces up to it and uses her imagination, even though she doesn't see the fate of Lucy for herself. She hears of it from Van Helsing and the people who did witness it, and she realizes that actually that is a fate worse than death. And she does say, well, actually, I'd rather die. And there's a big scene there where they all pledged their life towards saving her and trying to avoid that at all costs.
Yeah, which is something that I think is quite anachronist to a modernist utilitarian view of the world, so to speak. We don't really think that there is much worse than death, especially as atheism's basically propagated into everything. It's to the point where it's like, no, the most important thing in life is life itself, and that's it. That's where it ends as far as most modernists are concerned.
Well, there is a kind of interesting... Go ahead, Rupert.
I was just going to say, correct me if I'm wrong, but they also become enthralled, though, after death, as in, literally losing their freedom. So that might be something is... So that might be something that is more familiar to the the modernist mindset. So not only do you die, but you then go on to basically just become a meat puppet for this this monster for the rest of your existence.
That sounds familiar.
Well, and I would argue as well, it's not just that it's antithetical to modern life, it's that the modern man cannot even understand this reality. And that's represented by Harker in the beginning of the book. James and I were discussing this a little bit before the stream. When Harker goes to Transylvania, there are so many red flags as to what's in store for him. Even his journey there has weird supernatural elements to it.
Mm.
And then he is in this castle where he never sees any servants, and eventually he works out Dracula himself is the one doing everything and getting his food ready. And there's all these strange things like Dracula doesn't have a reflection in the mirror, that when he cuts himself, Dracula seems to lunge at his neck. But no, he just carries on there. He's got a business transaction to do. He's a man of reason and logic and mathematics, and part of the British Empire, which and well, the imperial world with its trains and machines which can expand across the world. But he's found himself in a tiny corner, a boundary point, which is maybe a meeting point of the old world of the aristocratic, the old world of the magical, the old world where there is religion and spiritual and moral reality, and he can't understand it at the beginning. It takes being horrified and tortured basically to be awoken to this reality.
Yeah.
I made a little. I just found, because I've met people in my life like Jonathan Harker, so I made a little profile of him as a person, just going off of his diary. So he's a skeptic. It reads in chapter 2, I read that every known superstition in the world is gathered into the horseshoe of the Carpathians, as if it were the center of some sort of imaginative whirlpool. And then, if so, my stay may be very interesting. So he's a skeptic. He's also, there are some parts of his diary that reminded me of reading something like The Lonely Planet. Where these tourists, very wealthy tourists, go to somewhere quote unquote undeveloped and say things like this. He says, Count Dracula had directed me to the Golden Krone Hotel, which I found to my great delight to be thoroughly old-fashioned. For of course I wanted to see all I could of the ways of the country. So you imagine this this Lonely Planet reading tourist, perhaps from a trust fund. They're traveling around Southeast Asia. They're going, oh, this place is authentic. How interesting. I must learn about all the ways here. And then he's, like Nathan mentioned earlier, he's business above all. That's why he's there. And I quote, it was all very ridiculous, but I did not feel comfortable. However, there was business to be done, and I could allow nothing to interfere with it. So above all to him is business, and that's why he's there. All these signs don't matter to him. He can deny his gut instincts about everything he sees because he's there for business.
Yeah. That's it. And that is, to some degree, encapsulation of the modernist view. It's like, no, everything's business. There's nothing spiritual. It doesn't exist. It's not real until suddenly you bump into it and then you go, ooh, I don't understand this, and I don't have the tools to understand this.
And I think that's right. It comes up against the limits. So it's an epistemological thing about, can somebody with the modern utilitarian mindset, materialist mindset, even comprehend these realities? So that's one aspect. And the other side of it is these realities, like Dracula, defy control through human reason and technology and so on. In a way, the whole horror genre, in a way, is that comment that actually there are things beyond our capabilities to master, and we may try, but that's why they're so terrifying, especially for us who live in a world where we think we've mastered everything and control everything, and our systems, have perfect authority over the natural world. Whereas actually, when we find a reality who we cannot master and who can play with us, it is deeply unsettling. And I think, for a metropolitan global businessman like Harker, that, who maybe would be the kind of audience that Stoker has, that is going to be a really horrifying prospect, that kind of thing existing.
Yeah, absolutely. I've to be fair, I've gone to almost the exact opposite end of the spectrum in that I'm reading a very, very modernist horror at the minute, which is Jurassic Park. I say horror, it's borderline, but there's points within that where it's like they've kind of messed around with nature a bit, and now it's biting back. And it's just that the idea that there is something just that much bigger than you that can just toss you around like a plaything's horrifying.
Rupert, were you going to come in there?
Oh, I forget the exact point, but one thing that did also come to mind was just the extent to which you have a predator and prey dynamic, and part of the, I guess, implicit horror of the situation is realizing that Dracula has found his way to London, and so now you have a situation where you have hundreds of thousands of Jonathan Harkers who are, prey in that kind of situation, without even recognizing that they're prey, and almost an apex predator that's been introduced to that environment, like a I don't know, a fox that's found its way into the battery farm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Go ahead, James.
That was when I was going to mention how now that Dracula is in London, that's something back 20 years ago when I first read it, that he comes across Mina and Lucy and arrives in Whitby. At the time, almost felt like, oh, this is too cliched. Oh, of course he finds the people who Jonathan Harker knows. Oh, what a coincidence. But now, having lived a bit more and come across more despicable people, I know that it makes absolute sense. Of course, Count Dracula is going to go straight after Jonathan's close friends, because it's as Rupert mentioned, it's the predator, and he's already seen the weak link that is Jonathan Harker, the lawyer who will do anything, it seems, for him, will set up houses in London for him, will set up addresses all across England for him to put his boxes in. And of course he would go straight after that, but he wants to hurt him even more because he's seen that weakness. And that's something, having now lived a bit more, that makes total sense. Whereas back then I was, I've probably shrugged my shoulders and thought, oh, of course he attacks the person known to him. Oh, that's because it's just for the book. It's a plot function to get someone who's close to Jonathan. What are the chances, in all of England? But now it makes total sense. Of course he's going to go after someone close to him.
Yeah. I think on him moving to England as well, there's one other part that I picked up on in the book that particularly interested us, that doesn't ever really get mentioned anywhere else, where it's specifically pointing to high trust society, whereby you have the point where they're plotting to break into Dracula's house in London. And the way they go around it is they say, well, if we're trying to break in, we're going to get caught. And they basically work around it and say, the way we're going to get around this is we're just going to hire a locksmith. He'll break the door down. And if the police ask us anything, we'll just tell them it's our house and you'll believe us because we've got a locksmith there. And that's literally the plot point. It's the police are so high trust that they just turn to the locksmith and go, are you breaking into that house? And he says, yes, I'm a locksmith. It's my job. And they just accept it.
And it's also they play into the fact that they have Lord Godalming. They say, we can be confident. We've got people of elite status with us. We can just be confident and brazen, and we can do it in the middle of the day because it won't look suspicious.
Yeah.
So and that gets to a point that Rupert was saying earlier, and I was wondering what maybe Rupert thought of this. You mentioned that the book seemed to critique a lot of the mores of aristocracy. At the same time, there are the characters like Lord Godalming, and many of these characters in this story are themselves the aristocracy, and they are themselves the ones who take down the Count in the end. I'm wondering what did you think about that?
True, but I mean, if you wanted to maintain the same frame, then it is almost like presenting an alternative, which is more amenable to the sensibility, the target audience's sensibilities, perhaps. So on the one hand, you have the bad aristocracy, and on the other hand, you have the good aristocracy that have made peace with modernity and conform to middle class norms.
Yeah.
They might do at the beginning, but they seem to, by the end, to not, in many ways, conform to that, since they're the ones who are. They seem to have. They all seem to have some sort of faith developing at the end, and they all seem to
Believe.
Yeah, believe in themselves as a group, and they very much play up to their roles as Lord Godalming and take advantage out of that in some ways.
Yeah, I mean the frame isn't perfect necessarily. I still see something distinct though in the way that there's something more pure and old world about how the Count Dracula is portrayed in terms of his aristocratic credentials, albeit in a very perverse way. Of how they're brought across compared to the aristocratic classes on the the aristocratic characters rather on the side of good, as it were. There is much less conflict with the modern world there, I would say.
I would add to that as well. I think Lord Godalming, while he is heroic, he is very much a kind of support character most of the time. So
yeah, he's not leading.
He can get things done with the consulate using his authority. He can be used as a way of passing into, this is our house. He manages to make arrangements for horses and things like that. But when it comes to the actual action, it's actually Jonathan Harker who, after his transformation, which we should touch on a little bit as well. But after his transformation, he totally abandons his kind of bean counter, nature, and is consumed by wrath and especially when Mina is attacked by Dracula. He just wants to go, he would burn the whole world down to go and kill
righteous fury. Righteous fury.
So he's the one of the figures who ends up actually killing the Count. The other one is the American Quincy Morris.
Yes.
And he's a funny character because for much of the book he is a secondary character. He's just kind of there in the background, kind of going along with things until the ending when he's a man of action and gives one of the fatal blows on the Count. So you could see that in a way it is the new world and the middle, both in terms of the middle class kind of lawyer and the American who lives in a society which is broken away from English aristocracy completely.
Yeah,
that are the ones that end up killing the Count, killing aristocracy, putting it into the ground forever. I don't know, but I can see that there is you could definitely read that as saying, it's not a strong endorsement of aristocracy, at least.
Yeah, definitely. What do you think of the idea that the way that the Count and all of the vampires dies, when they die, they don't writhe around in pain and stuff. They're described as peaceful after having died. It's like even Dracula himself at the end, Bram Stoker makes a really big point of saying he wasn't writhing around in pain going, "Oh, you've killed me." He's literally just lying there, and the last thing that crosses across his face is just a visage of peace. Mm-hmm. He's at peace with the fact that he's died.
Yeah, in my memory, his death was very, very different from how I remember it as a youth. Before reading this again, I remembered there was, they get the stake in and they go, "Rah!" and they try and fight back, but no, they just, like you said, they just disintegrate into dust. And then there's the face that Van Helsing recalls and says there's a face of profound peace.
Yeah.
Yeah, very different from how they show them in films nowadays.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, I think I recently watched immediately after having finished the book, I watched the Hammer horror film of it. I watched, so obviously it's Christopher Lee, but I can remember watching the film, and then when they kill Mina Harker in the film, she does ride around a little bit, but then they actually show the visage of peace. They show her at peace with the fact that she's, being killed, and that's it. She doesn't disintegrate or anything like that, but she does find peace. Whereas in the horror film, at the end when they kill Dracula, it is very much he's driving around and then he just turns into ash and he's like, "You beat me, damn it."
I suppose it comes across in the. Sorry, Nathan, go ahead.
Go on, James.
I was just going to say, I suppose that's how it comes across in the book, as if they're, in a way, happy to be relieved of their situation, whereas in later films they appear to be they still want to hold on to this existence. And in the original book, it's a letting go now. Oh, okay, I can be done with this now. It's over finally. Yeah.
I think you're right. Definitely within the more modern films, especially, it's the Shona's continuing to fight for this cursed afterlife. Whereas in like the Hammer horror film, they do at least try to pay it some homage with Mina Harker's death. They show her as being peaceful once she's been killed. Well, I say killed, once she's been finished off as an undead.
I mean, insofar as it does actually take inspiration from Eastern European folklore, I believe most of the monsters in a lot of Slavic folklore, especially, is that they are generally, I believe, spirits who, actual mortal souls who have, failed to be put to rest properly in some way or another. So that would fit very well with the idea that they don't actually necessarily want to be, an evil spirit in the world. They would rather be set at peace.
Yeah, I think that's fair. How old exactly are vampires as well? Because I can remember seeing something saying that there's a lot of cultures that have a variation on vampires that go back to ancient times. And I don't know, obviously everyone, I say everyone, it seems like everyone thinks that vampires were basically created by Bram Stoker. But there seems to be specific vampire lore that dates back prior to Bram Stoker even.
Yeah, I mean, just speaking from my sort of wheelhouse, China doesn't really have a equivalent of vampires. There's a thing known as jiangshi, which translates just as a rigid corpse. Jiang just means rigid, and shi just means corpse. And you might see them in films. If you ever watch any Hong Kong horror films, they're the ones in the Manchu Qing dynasty style pigtails, and they jump like that.
Right.
But in every other way, none of the qualities or the characteristics are like vampires. They feed on qi. They don't feed on blood. They're just corpses that rise up from the dead for some reason. So there's a very different tradition of that over there. And that's why you'll see they're always wearing the pigtails in those films. That means it's post 1600s because they didn't wear pigtails before that.
I think I can vaguely remember there being something similar to vampires in Celtic mythology. I think I can't remember the specifics of it though. I have to look it up after the video.
There are a lot of precedents for undead creatures in Western European mythology and medieval. And I mean, one of the interesting things is when you kind of press into these ideas. So where do the dead reside? Underground, often in barrows, under hills, and so on. Well, it just so happens that a lot of fairies and monsters are also believed to live under hills, and there's a kind of there's almost a sense in which the fairy otherworld is also the realm of the undead. and perhaps
Yes.
the two get conflated together in various ways. They are distinct, but there's a kind of crossing point, and so they both exist in this parallel reality which breaks into ours occasionally and
Yeah.
upsets ours, and we can't control it, and we're very much at the mercy of the fairy / undead. And I know in particular that Stoker read a lot of vampire kind of accounts, medieval vampire accounts,
Right.
and a lot to do with Eastern European folklore. Before there's extensive notes he made about vampire lore. So a lot of the stuff like to do with garlic, for example, he didn't just come up with that. He
Yeah.
actually had read that in books about the undead, and so it was like, okay, that needs to go in. And that's one of the things when you read the book, actually, you realize is he doesn't spend a lot of time explaining why things happen. He doesn't go into like the origins of vampirism. He doesn't explain why garlic works against them. That's just a matter of tradition. It's received wisdom.
Yeah.
And so therefore it just has to be stated. There's no logical argument to make for this. And that is a very, actually, if you think about it, again, as opposed to the kind of rationalist mindset, which would want to have those things before you justify it. Because of course, why would you use garlic to stop a blood-sucking undead? It doesn't make any logical sense. But no, actually, an appeal to tradition and convention, what Harker might call superstition at the beginning of the story, is actually the thing which helps to resist this monster and overcome it. So in a way, actually, Stoker's own research kind of feeds into the actual story in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, every time they try to just deconstruct and talk about why these things came about in any kind of horror film, it always is so dull. So yeah, there's no need for it. It's never been done well.
Yeah, you don't really need to explain it beyond. It's ontological evil. That's all you need to know about it. It's here to kill you. You don't need to understand it beyond understanding how to kill it.
They do try and give, in the Dracula 1992 film by Coppola, they do try and give Dracula a bit of justification for what he became. Does anyone recollect that? Yeah. So his wife commits suicide after believing he died, having gone to fight the Turks, and then he's raging, and he makes a pact. After that, it's hinted that he puts his sword into the cross, and then the rest is history.
Mm. I think there is. Is that the one where they make sort of suggest that he is Vlad Tepes?
So I didn't catch that.
So I'm saying Vlad Tepes.
Vlad the Impaler.
Yeah.
Yeah, they do. I mean, they give it a history like he was the Wallachian who went off to fight the Turks. Yeah, so they do.
Yeah.
And they give a specific date. I think it was early 1400s, something like that.
Yeah. Because that's always one thing that everyone points out as a bit of a funny, is that Dracula, for all he's evil and a monster, is everyone's of the opinion that he is very much based upon Vlad the Impaler, who, when you look into him, it's like, yeah, he kind of pales in comparison to what Vlad the Impaler did.
Speaking of the Count, did any of you guys find that when he's having his evening chats with Jonathan Harker, it's in some ways, I know there's a lot of difference, but in some ways it reminded me of like a Dawkins and a Peterson conversation. Sort of, I know Pete, and there's a lot of difference between Count and Peterson, but I mean, here's the monologue here from, I think, chapter 4. We, as the Kellys, have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as lion fights for lordship. It almost reminds me of when Peterson's talking about the predator and the animals, and at least he's trying to get at depth, whereas Harker is just like, he's sitting there, oh yeah, I'll do my best to get you the that flat in London. It's just at least Count Dracula has some depth to him. Yes, there's evil, and at least there's depth. I mean, who would you prefer to have a conversation with, Jonathan Harker or Count Dracula?
Yeah, that's it. You're going to pick Dracula every single time.
If okay, just a conversation, nothing else. Just to know what happened.
No evening meal afterwards.
No evening meal. No staying in the castle. Just a conversation. Which would you prefer to talk with? I know which one I'd talk with any day, just to know what his life was like.
Yeah, that's it. It's such an easy decision. I mean, it would be an easy decision even if Dracula was just a couple, literally like the same age as Jonathan Harker. Just the difference in ideology there is in and of itself interesting enough.
At least there's evil with depth, whereas Harker's just sort of, just what can you say about him until he
shallow grey suit until he changes.
Yeah. yeah.
I think that's a problem with a lot of modernity, and it almost feels like that's what our sort of heroes have become, especially in like modern films. It's just a case of like the wear all of the clothes of a hero, and it's like, okay, that's it. That's all you need. You just need the outfit. You don't need anything else. You don't need any depth. It's just the outfit, and there you go. You're good to go.
I think there's a really interesting kind of symbolism in the kind of rootedness of Dracula to the earth in the coffins, actually, because the earth is so Dracula is tied to these coffins. He can't just live somewhere or exist somewhere. He actually has to reside within these coffins. He has to rest in them. If they were all destroyed, which is the plan of the heroes, then he has nowhere to stay in London. He would disintegrate eventually, and so he has to fly back to Transylvania quickly or escape back to Transylvania, I should say, to recover his kind of rootedness. But the earth is holy ground, so it's ground from chapels or churches.
Yeah,
of course, it's consecrated ground. His coffins are always, well, usually they would be in a chapel as well, and certainly in Castle Dracula, he sleeps in a giant coffin in the middle of the chapel.
Yeah,
and but this earth is being desecrated essentially by his being, by his monstrous nature, his antipathy to Christian living and life and so on. He no longer serves God, but essentially is a servant of the devil, or is himself demonic. And I think what kind of strikes me about that is, Dracula is a creature who is rooted in a religious reality from the outset. He cannot exist in a purely material world. He can't be a creature produced by modernity. He exists in that religious sphere where there are decisions of a moral, spiritual nature, whatever you want to call it, which have real meaning and weight. They matter. It's the eternity of your soul, is what we were saying earlier, right?
Yeah.
Whereas Harker's reality doesn't have that, and so that's in part why Dracula is much more compelling, because he belongs in a world which is so much deeper than the one of Harker, and it's only as the heroes enter into that world that they too become more interesting, but also become far more compelling and noble and virtuous, so that by the end, somebody like Harker is a hero, a genuine hero who doesn't belong in modernity anymore. So I totally see what you're saying, and I think just the earth itself indicates what you're trying to say.
In that sense, it also asserts the primacy of the spiritual world and the spiritual worldview, because despite Dracula having left, or having entered the modern world, as it were, when he transplants himself into London, his power remains, and the power of the all those spiritual trappings remain. It's just that the people of London of that time are oblivious to that fact until, as you say, the people who are actively pursuing, like the band who are actively pursuing Dracula, kind of take some tentative steps into that world,
and indeed,
to try and gain some of his power.
It's only with religious and traditional means that they're actually able to kill him. as well.
Yeah.
Or to resist him. So the cross, for example, or the consecrated wafer. It's these sorts of things, the host, which repel him. It's not some mathematical, logical, or technological thing even.
Yeah, it's purely a religious takedown of him. And on that, it's kind of on slightly picking up Rupert's frame from earlier. It's a corruption of blood and soil nationalism to some degree. You literally have Dracula, who is this blood-sucking monster that literally carries his soil around with him.
I mean, you can read into that what you will about Stoker views on certain groups. I feel like we shouldn't be too explicit, but
we'll not stray too far into that. But it's just the pure idea that it's quite clearly, I think, at least in my mind, it's clearly set up as a jab at the old aristocracy and their ideas of blood and soil.
I mean, Count Dracula says it himself. I've got a quote right here. Were I to move to London, none are there who would know me. Yeah. That is enough for me. Here I am a noble, I am a boyar, the common people know me, and I am master. But a stranger in a strange land, he is no one.
Yeah. Yeah, he comes to London very much as an immigrant, and he intends on taking advantage of the high trust society that London is. He just moves in and nobody's going to question it. And nobody's going to question it, even when it gets to the point where you have Dracula turning some people within the population into vampires, and they're then going out and there's children disappearing, and nobody's really doing anything about it because it's the poor urchin children that are disappearing. And everyone's like, it's just the urchins. We're not really going to move heaven and earth to save them. If an urchin or two goes missing, that's just the child. It's just you're an urchin. It's what happens.
It's part and parcel.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's quite noteworthy, I think, that Stoker was around in Whitechapel when you had Jack the Ripper, the Jack the Ripper murders, and he actually wrote about these and was quite appalled at the lack of response really from the police in protecting the community and so on. So that definitely, it definitely ties in with a figure like Dracula having the same effect. It's almost uncanny and a bit disturbing how close it is. I wanted to add as well, you mentioned the high trust society, and I think you're right. Just as it works for the heroes to their advantage, it's also there for Dracula's. But he's also taking advantage of laissez-faire capitalism. Right, we've mentioned Harker is a man of business, but it's interesting what Dracula does. He says at one point, because Harker isn't based in London, he's based in Exeter. His firm, I think it's Exeter. He's definitely not in London, because he says, I wanted to use your firm because a London firm might have local associations which would get in the way of doing this deal. They might have reasons to stop me, essentially, because they have a tie to the local area. And this kind of, to me, gets at something about this kind of free market capitalism, is that it's an anti-traditional, anti-local force, where essentially, if something's more efficient and it pays more, if you make more profit, then it doesn't matter if it's a vampiric monster from a foreign land who hates your people. But even on a lesser level, it doesn't matter if whoever it is, as long as they're willing to pay, they can buy your property and move into your country and do disrupt that local community. And I think Stoker's kind of pointing that out, that if we didn't have this kind of economic system which appealed to that primarily, rather than supporting a local community already, he never would have got into the country, and he would never have done his terrible things.
There's a vampire on the loose in London, but it's okay because the GDP is up from his transfer into our lawyers here across the country. It's okay, the GDP has gone up.
Yeah, it does almost feel like a not in my backyard kind of case. He's like, well, you don't have any direct connection to London, so it's not as much of a problem for you. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say it just reminds me a little bit of I think it was a Japanese delegation, like an early Japanese delegation to Europe, who were asking again about like the ownership of land and what you can do with the land. I think this was in the Netherlands, and they were kind of shocked to find out that you could just buy land anywhere and do anything with it, and no one would stop you. And so he asked, so if I were to buy this land and build a fortress on it in the name of my own country, that would be okay. And yet the Dutchman was a little bit surprised and sort of saying, well, yes, but
It's nuts.
there's no real answer.
I mean, interestingly enough, you also see the same thing in the Lord of the Rings, actually, with the scouring of the Shire. Right? It's how do Saruman and the ruffians get into the Shire? Lotho Pimple, which I love that name. That man was cursed from the beginning, that hobbit. But what does he do? He, rather than just being happy with his own little subsistence life, he starts buying up property in the Shire, starts buying mills, starts trying to produce more than just what's needed to survive and have a good life, and start exporting it around Middle Earth. And then, to increase the efficiency and the output, invites in these thugs essentially to help him grow his wealth, grow the wealth of the Shire, despite the fact it's to the detriment of everybody in the Shire. Like, they're losing their property. There's actually like famines starting because of this. They actually have enough food, but they're sending it away, so they're not able to eat enough. And eventually, this the thugs impose lots of laws through force, which destroy the culture and make the hobbits absolutely miserable and enslaved, essentially. But it's through that mechanism of finance, of selling what shouldn't be sold, giving away. It allows a gateway into a vulnerable, high trust community. The kind of this kind of capitalism.
Yeah.
It needs to be protected economically, and I see that in Stoker as well. Kind of interesting that quite a few thinkers around this period are having that response, because oftentimes the argument is often presented as like capitalism v communism or something like that. Whereas actually none of these, I don't think like Tolkien was a communist because he opposed laissez-faire capitalism, right? And I don't think Stoker is a communist either, although people might have that sort of interpretation. He's just making a more general point about, who are you letting in if you're just going to sell all of your land and property?
Yeah, maybe putting your land up for sale to the entire world is not the greatest plan.
Yeah, I mean, even within the high trust society, there are still around this time kind of rogue elements who are willing to. I think this kind of example is basically explicitly what was used to justify more economic intervention, basically by the government, and more restriction and regulation. But the idea of in the center of a residential district, especially like a poor residential district, just buy up a load of land and install whatever, like a brickworks or a steel mill there or something, regardless of the consequence to all of the people who live around there. And the middle and upper class revulsion at that idea of just complete disregard for the well-being of the people around, and the idea that shouldn't be done. But obviously you can take that in a very bad direction, and well, it's not without consequence in other ways. Modern zoning laws, I think probably would have a lot of bad things to say about those as well.
Well, that's true. I mean, if you look at, I mean, this is jumping right to recently, but if you look at something like Clarkson's Farm, I don't know if you guys have seen this, but Jeremy Clarkson, one of the things he wants to do is turn an old barn into a restaurant on his farm. And he's got all the local farmers to agree to this because they'll sell their produce in the farm shop and in the restaurant. But the council don't want lots of people coming to Clarkson Farm, in part because it's Jeremy Clarkson, in part because it disrupts the roads, the traffic around this small little village. But they just bog him down in planning permission, and it's almost impossible for him to actually to get this done. So I could see the flip side of this is the bureaucrat in the local parish council who holds up something so it can be abused. That's what I'm saying. I'm agreeing with you, Rupert, in terms of in a way the response of planning laws was not quite the right way, because it just gave power to other groups who didn't necessarily have the community's interest at heart either.
Well, in a sense, it's the same problem in both cases. Like when somebody gets a hold of gets a hold of power that they probably shouldn't have and uses it in ways that are detrimental to everyone around them. It doesn't necessarily matter what structure you or laws you're couching that in. It's still going to create bad outcomes. Because within the confines of the same example, we can agree that having a toxic emission-producing industry in the middle of a residential district is not a good idea. But equally, the far side of on the other side of that spectrum, you've got something like Texas, where basically every zone is miles apart from everything else, and it's completely impractical to actually move about in any way without things like cars or public transport, maybe even if that's provisioned or.
Yeah, I think I get what you mean. You can go to two extremes on both ends of the scale, and it'll ruin your community. You have the community be cohesive. If you're putting things too far away, you lose cohesion.
Well, it's ruining it in two different ways, basically.
Yeah,
pick your poison.
Yeah, that's it. You can use the. Sorry, go on.
I pick vampirism. That's my poison choice.
I don't know. I think I like the flavor of my immortal soul remaining clean and not having been tainted by vampirism. But I can see the appeal. Live forever.
Well, one character we haven't spoken about is Renfield. Or is it
Yes.
Is it Renfield? Yes.
It is Renfield.
Who a lot of the book is dedicated to. And at first you might think, how is this connected to Dracula? But essentially there's a character, John Seward, who's a psychiatrist. He heads up an asylum. He's also a student of Van Helsing's, or once studied with him, and is himself a respected man of science. And he has this case with this one individual in the asylum, Renfield, who seems to have these weird behaviors, such as he kind of collects creatures and has the next thing on the food chain eat those creatures. So, for example, he collects lots of flies, and what does he get next? Was it the birds? Birds will eat the flies. He then wants a cat to eat the birds, and then he eats the cat, and then the cycle goes round and round and round.
Yeah,
and it's like this thing of like devouring life to grow your own life, but there is this suggestion of humans may not be the end of this food chain. Actually, we are prey, just as Rupert was saying earlier, for a figure like Dracula. So is there something of that kind of absorption of others' powers or essences, which is kind of part of the appeal or enticing character of the vampiric? It's in a way it's draining others to build up yourself, and you could see that in just in a literal sense, but also maybe metaphorical for how people with power often kind of crush others to build up their own. They kind of pillage and take to grow their own empire and force, rather than giving or working together or something like that. James coming in.
Yeah, and also it shows a lot about his personality that he's willing to abuse animals, eh? It very much shows always someone, in my experience in life also, People like that tend to be evil, and also there are a lot of ways that Renfield tries to manipulate people. He does many scenes where he does fake begging, where he says, "Oh, you're causing me so much trauma, keeping me inside this hospital, Dr. Seward." Just rings too many bells to us nowadays. It's the kind of people who always claim abuse, where that kind of very sort of frontal performatory way of showing it isn't actually natural to someone who has really been abused. They tend to be numb. And also he appeals to their pride. We get to learn more about Quincy and Lord Godalming via Renfield. He says, "Oh, Lord Godalming, I had the honor of seconding your father at the Wyndham." He tries to appeal to their pride, to manipulate them so that he can escape this mental institution that he's in. Very manipulative character, very evil, very talented. Many people would have fallen to his tricks, but Dr. Seward doesn't.
He does occasionally like give in to various things, but he learns, I think, throughout it. So for example, he does give him a cat because he thinks this will help him, and he's kind of intrigued to see where it goes. And then is there not a bit where he kind of he gives him like certain privileges to go outside and or to wander about, and then he escapes to what just so happens to be Dracula's like house next to the asylum.
Yeah, and he goes to the zoo, doesn't he? As well, he tries to get
right.
a big animal because he wants to level up from cat to a big zoo animal like a hippo or something.
very dark mind, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
But as you say, like he reveals a level of intelligence, and in terms of even his conversations with like Mina Harker in particular, he suddenly snaps out of all of these things and is very like he's dealing in like metaphysics and he can deal with Dr. Seward on a level of scientific discussion as well. So he's not somebody who's ignorant and who's just been duped into this. He's actually fully aware of what he's embraced. Yeah.
Do you remember that bit where Mina walks in and she sort of treats him with a lack of respect, and he respects that more and treats her better than other people do? This is the mind of the sociopath, someone who will, they see that someone is being cruel to them, so therefore they will be nicer to them.
Yeah, that's true.
There's a lot of psychological truth in here that Bram Stoker's getting at. I wonder whether he actually worked in mental institutions, because very often they display characteristics like Renfield does here.
That's interesting. I mean, it definitely. I do remember reading that he seemed to have some acquaintance with Freud, for example. And
oh dear.
Well,
was in those circles. Well, yes, but in terms of then he was in a circle where people were discussing psychological profiles and actually dealing with asylums. He knew these people, right? And so, I mean, that to me, that's kind of interesting when you think of Dr. Seward. Is he a kind of one of these figures, a Freudian figure of some kind?
Yeah,
I'm not
standing for them
in terms of his, his theories, but that's the sort of mind he has. And it takes him a lot more to, like Harker, actually, because of his scientific background, it takes him longer to accept the realities in front of him than it does Quincy or Lord Godalming.
Out of pure curiosity, does anyone here believe? I'm assuming everyone here is relatively of a scientific mind to some degree. Or what degree of belief do you all have? Out of curiosity.
Do you mean in vampires?
Just belief in general, as in like not specifically in vampires, in religion and spirituality.
Yeah, I believe there's God. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Fair.
I flip in certain ways, but I believe in God. But some days I'll believe in every supernatural being that the medievals believed in.
Yep.
And other
Yep.
days I think I'm a modern. It's impossible for me to believe those things. But I am quite open to those realities being real, whether in a literal physical sense or whether it's psychological or something. I don't know, but I have a gut feeling that there are such
More.
monsters.
There is something more out there. What about yourself, Rupert?
Yeah, I'm in much the same situation as Nathan.
Fair.
Well,
That would be very.
What was that?
Sorry, Rupert.
What about you?
Oh, what about me? I'm a bit of a funny one because I'm quite a scientific mind. I'm specific. I'll give myself away a little bit. I'm a mechanical engineer specifically, so relatively scientific industry. But I'm of the opinion that there is something more out there, and I've had one or two experiences that have kind of pushed us even further towards that. Like one of the most recent ones, and the ones that really stood out was I visited the Vatican, and I was stood in front of the grave of John Paul, and I watched what I am fairly certain was just some form of spirit float above and then out of a window, which it's funny because it's like when you stood there with the scientific mind, you kind of like taking it apart, and then there's another part of you that's like, no, it was real, it happened, and I don't have anything that can explain it beyond I believe it happened, therefore it happened.
And I mean that does correspond with like Dr. Seward's experience, for example. Van Helsing, there's this wonderful passage where Van Helsing outlines his theory that Lucy, who is Mina's friend, is becoming a vampire.
Yeah.
And in fact she is a vampire who's kidnapping children in London. Now, for context as well, half the men in this book propose to Lucy at one point or another. So they are all deeply love this woman. They all hold her to the highest heaven. So it's not just anybody that they're talking about here. So somebody he himself cared for deeply, and he's, on the one hand, he's really shocked and horrified at the suggestion. On the other, his scientific mind can't handle it. And Van Helsing goes through all these things which science cannot deal with. It's a fantastic passage. And it's like,
I have the quote in front of me if you want it, Nathan, but go on.
Go for it.
Okay, Can you tell me how the Indian fakir can make himself to die and have been buried, and his grave sealed and corn sowed on it, and the corn reaped and be cut and sown and reaped and cut again, and then men come and take away the unbroken seal, and that there lie the Indian fakir not dead, but that rise up and walk amongst them as before. And then here John Seward says, here I interrupted him. I was getting bewildered. He so crowded on my mind his list of nature's eccentricities and possible impossibilities that my imagination was getting fired. I had the dim idea that he was teaching me. I've come across people who've reacted to things such as this like that. Yeah.
Well, and so what's striking there is, in a way, Van Helsing can try and explain this as much as he wants, and he can have an effect on him. He can bewilder him, but fundamentally, it takes actually seeing Lucy and experiencing it for himself that Dr. Seward is eventually convinced of this. It's an empiricist, I guess, approach, actually. It's that you have to experience this reality to fully accept it. And so, in a way, I can see that with your experience, Green. It's this
seeing it is believing.
Seeing is believing. You couldn't. Yeah. If I tried to talk you into belief in ghosts or spirits, it wouldn't have the same power as actually, you having that experience.
Yeah, it really doesn't. It's one of those things where it's like you'll be a skeptic your whole life, and then you'll just see one thing and go, oh, that's That's something else. I don't have anything to explain it.
And just speaking from personal experience, it also can be a very gradual thing, and also reason can play into it too. If you read things like, for example, if you read St. Thomas Aquinas, one can reason one's way into belief as well as having an experience at the same time, which was what happened for me gradually.
Yeah, it's I can't remember who it was that said it, but it's the first sip of the glass of natural science will lead you an atheist, but at the bottom of the glass, God is waiting for you.
What's kind of interesting, kind of tying this into somebody like Renfield and what we've been talking about earlier, is so when Harker escapes Castle Dracula, he escapes from Transylvania and ends up in hospital, and he knows what he experienced, right? He knows that in the middle of the night, particles of air and dust suddenly materialized as a vampire woman who tried to then suck his blood, right? He knows that happened, as ridiculous as it sounds. He knows what Dracula tried to do to him. He knows these things happened, but the doctors in the hospital treat him as insane, and that actually he needs medication to help him. And then he's, when he's reunited with his wife, he's this kind of shell of a man who they warn her never raise this thing again with him because it will unlock this kind of trauma that he's had. And it's interesting because at one point he then sees Dracula in London and all these feelings start rushing back. But then, Mina tries to kind of deal with this and writes a letter to Van Helsing to try and, get help for her husband. And what eventually happens is Van Helsing's able to confirm Jonathan's experience based on his dealings with Lucy.
Yeah.
And that's the thing which changes him, because it's not that his experience, the thing that was traumatizing him was that his experience was being denied.
Yeah.
And the reality he had experienced, the horrors he had experienced he was being told they're not true. You are misremembering. They were an illusion or delusion of your mind. But when he was able to accept those things were real, he's like a man reformed. He suddenly looks 10 years younger. He's filled with vigor and energy, and he's actually like content in his heart. So there's a kind of interesting commentary there on the kind of diagnosis of madness, and maybe it's misapplication in terms of denying the reality of the religious or things which it can't contain or identify.
And I mean, also, Jonathan Harker had no framework in which to understand anything he experienced. It would have come as a complete shock to him, a shock to the system, which would have taken time for him to comprehend and think about and work through. And perhaps meeting someone like Van Helsing eventually would have helped that, because there's Van Helsing there with his knowledge of these things, and they don't have conversations in the book directly, but it makes sense that they would have.
Yeah, I think to some degree as well, it's not even just the idea of it being denied. I think it's that it's preferable to deny it. You don't want to believe that this reality was what was real. You want that to be complete and utter fantasy made up. And even if it does mean that you are insane, you'll accept it because it's better for you to be insane than for that to actually have happened.
Yeah, I mean that's true. That's true. Yeah, kind of hiding away from it until he actually has a proper framework to understand it. I think you're right, James, that having that conceptual basis or ability to comprehend what's happened is part of that process of acceptance. It's not just accepting the experience, it's being able to interpret it correctly, because otherwise it's totally incomprehensible, and you can't place its significance in any way. You can't but you can't even really understand it on a basic literal level of understanding. It's just like anything. We need concepts to kind of define those experiences, such as emotions. Of course, that then changes our relationship to the very phenomena, but it has an importance. So I totally understand that. And just on Van Helsing, I'd be curious as to what you guys think about him, because like in the popular kind of presentation, Van Helsing is, well, like, I remember the film with Hugh Jackman as Van Helsing, right? He's like a guy like with a crossbow fighting demons from hell all the time. Like he's some kind of action hero. But in this book, he is much more interesting to me in that he's like this old man. He's almost like a Gandalf figure, right?
Yes, he is. He's more of a scholar.
He's also quite, because we've already gone through almost half of the book with Harker's experiences and him returning, until we get suddenly emotion from Van Helsing. There's a scene where he sees and he works out what's going on with Lucy Westenra. And then here's the quote here. He raised his arms again as though appealing to the whole universe. God, 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 he said, what have we done? What has this poor thing done that we are sore beset? And before this, everyone's so cold and clinical. We have the Harkers of the world. We have Count Dracula before we know what exactly he's doing. And there's a lot more emotion to him than just a Gandalf. He's quite raw. He's logical, but also he's emotional as well. He's in touch with.
He's human.
Yes. I hesitate to use that phrase. I was going to say in touch with his emotions, but he definitely knows when he's enraged, and he's happy to express that, and he has a right to be.
Yeah, he comes across as a much more human character than Gandalf, because Gandalf is literally an angel descended from heaven to fix things, whereas you can very much see that Van Helsing is just a man, but he's a man that understands this. He gets what he is fighting against. And as such, he then goes on to attempt to teach the others and say, look, this is how we're going to deal with it.
Push back if it's not the correct interpretation, but I sort of interpreted it a little bit more, well, as though he's got kind of a spiritual streak in him himself, but that it's coming from more of a Western perspective, which is kind of interesting. You know, like more of a, so he's not drawing from the same tradition as, well, you know, he's not drawing from the Romanian tradition or the Eastern European tradition, but instead he is kind of like bringing back more spiritual knowledge from the West that has otherwise been forgotten within the context of somewhere like London. Am I off the mark there?
I think that's a fair commentary, because he is obviously, he's from the continent, but not as far afield as Dracula is. So I think you're right in suggesting that he's the Western representation of faith in the book.
Well, I'd say Christendom in particular.
Yeah.
It's drawing on the official rites of the church. So it's the wafer, the consecrated host, which defends, right? So it's appealing directly to the mass as the instrument of protection. That automatically brings in connections with exorcism, and there's, you know, and so on. So it's definitely drawing on that kind of tradition without there being perhaps the idea that one must commit to that faith. There's no discussion of like, oh, we must all convert to Roman Catholicism now.
I don't even know that it's that. I think it's just the belief in something, in that he believes in it, and he has the religion backing him up. And it's, to some degree, I think it would have been taken that everyone in this age would be religious, maybe not to the same degree that he is, but again, going way back to the start, you've got the discussion of the immortal soul, and everyone just accepts it as given. Granted, they've seen things by this point, but they don't even hesitate. They just accept, yes, her immortal soul is a real thing, and it's more important than the physical body. Whereas I think even in modern day, you could show a lot of people a story like this that would occur in modern day. You could show them all of this stuff, and there'd still be people sat there as skeptics saying, "Nah, I don't believe in an immortal soul. We're not just going to kill them."
I guess what I'm trying to say in response to that is that you're right that there is this kind of general Christian attitude within the book.
Yes, yeah,
of defending the immortal soul, but it's ecumenical. It doesn't require you to commit
yes,
to one denomination or another, and that's quite interesting when many of the things which defend the characters are explicitly from a kind of medieval Christendom, kind of from Catholicism, the consecrated host. Now, we're never told whether Van Helsing is a Roman Catholic, but there's no kind of oh, this is the way now that we must commit to fully. There's a sense in which we can draw from lots of Christian traditions. We could draw from whatever traditions, and as long as that helps us, that's okay. But there isn't a kind of reflection on what I don't want to say belief system, because it's more like what way of life has to be committed to. It kind of draws itself up to the brink and then holds back from committing to a way. It's a bit like Carlyle in that respect. It's something like Carlyle, I would say, who sees truth in Christian traditions, but because of his lack of faith in the explicit creeds, he wouldn't commit to it.
It isn't made explicit, that is true. At the same time, the proof is in the pudding of the action.
Yeah.
That Van Helsing is using these things that are held by Catholics to be holy and to have power over Dracula. And they are the things that work. And those are the things that he uses. So although it isn't explicit, it is implicit.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's all Christian rites that he's using to overpower Dracula. It's one of the things I found quite interesting, again, when you go from the book to the film, is I've not seen any of the films using the host against vampires. I can only think of films using the cross, and they even have suggestions that if you hold the cross up and you don't believe, it won't work. Which I think someone's kind of mentioned in the comments there. But yeah, it's you've got to have that belief in what you're doing for it to work. Because if you would just hold the cross aloft but you don't believe in it, it's not got the same power.
See, I mean that's interesting, because the host, I think, if you follow its logical conclusion that the host is the body of Christ, then it would have that power regardless of whether somebody believed in it or not.
Yeah.
So it puts the emphasis again on a more, it places more emphasis on supernatural power than on the individual's conviction.
Might be an indication of how the different mediums that have explored the idea have kind of like changed our perception of vampires then, because I can very much imagine the conversation which happened around that, because the consecrated host works in a literary format, but visually it would need some explanation. Otherwise, it doesn't. For one thing, it doesn't look quite as impressive, and you're not able to convey as much information without having to explain it.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah, not unless you've already got the implicit knowledge of what that is. Because to
Yeah.
anyone, there's many people outside of the Christian religion that look at the host and go, "It's just bread," and it's like, no, it's much, much more than bread.
I mean, that's how even at the beginning, how Harker reacts to having crucifixes put on him. The people in the local area of Count Dracula's castle were saying, you know, take this. If you're going to go, don't go. Firstly, they're trying to tell him, don't go. And the whole area around his castle is desolate. No one lives around there. But they're all trying to warn him. They force crucifixes on him. And even he describes himself, I think, as a man of the Church of England. I think there's a quote I recall somewhere. As a man of the Church of England. Even he feels awkward around, a crucifix. That goes to show the state of the Church of England, even back in the 1800s. That people have a awkwardness around the central symbol.
Yeah.
So
I'm just reading a bit more of the comments here, and he's mentioned that basically he's saying that the idea is if you don't have the faith, the crucifix won't be there to be reached for, which then makes it even more interesting that you've got the people around Dracula's castle forcing the crucifix on and be like, no, you will take this if you're going. We don't want you to go, but you will have it.
Well, of course, is it not? So when he's shaving and he accidentally cuts himself, and Dracula's behind him and lunges for him, he's got the crucifix on,
Yes,
and that's actually what saves him, right?
Yeah,
Because
he stops.
Dracula kind of recoils in horror, or is actually, I can't remember if he's actually touches it or he just recoils, but it saves him in that situation, and he still doesn't quite know. But he's like, I'm going to keep this on, and it's going to help me as I go on.
That bit of writing is hilarious. He says he just shattered into 1,000 pieces on the stones in the courtyard when he cuts his mirror. Mm-hmm. And then he withdrew without a word. And then Harker's diary reads, "It is very annoying, for I do not see how I am to shave." That's his only reaction to his employer having a meltdown in front of him over him cutting himself in front of a mirror and throwing it into the courtyard far below. His only reaction is, "It is very annoying. I do not now have a mirror to shave myself."
The most businessman-like reaction imaginable. It's like, don't mind the fact he lunged at us. It's like, no, my mirror. I can't shave now. I need to be well maintained and well remain within, my socially acceptable limits.
Just to say, Rupert has had to drop out. He's had to go, but we thank him for his contribution, and we'll go for a bit longer. If you gentlemen are up for it,
I'm fine to go for a bit longer. What
I would ask, because we've maybe got about half an hour to go, we can keep chatting, but what I'd encourage the audience to do is if you have any comments or questions you would like us to discuss, feel free to put them in the comments, and we'll do our best. We'll do our best in terms of exploring them. I wanted to give you both a chance before we, as we come towards the end. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about with Dracula that we haven't touched on already?
There was one silly one, which was, have you watched the Hammer horror film of Dracula?
No, I haven't, I'm afraid.
There's a brilliant scene in it where it's Christopher Lee running up the stairs as Dracula. There was something about it that just looked incredibly familiar to me, and I was like, ooh, that's incredible, because obviously he's massive. He's like 6'5", and he was told, I think one of the things he was told when he was first cast was like, no, you're too big to be an actor, you're too tall. But he runs up the stairs, and he's like taking the stairs basically like 5 steps at a time because he's a giant. And then you watch, I think it's Peter Cushing come in after it and chase him upstairs. But just the other day on Halloween, as is tradition of mine and my girlfriend, we're watching The Nightmare Before Christmas. And I suddenly realized why the run looked so familiar, because it literally almost looks identical to when Jack Skellington's running up the hill. Just the movement of it was just so, it was literally as if it had just been mapped on from one to the other.
So a nice little homage there, a little reference.
It does feel like an homage. I'm not sure whether it's just purely down to like they're trying to make Jack look very tall, but it literally just the way he moves is almost identical.
That's quite cool. That's cool. James, was there anything you wanted to kind of bring up? You're muted,
I suppose it's interesting. It's noteworthy that although these topics are we've talked about figures similar to vampires a long time before, it's interesting that only in the late 1800s, when sort of pre-Reformation England and society was a distant memory, and these things, these hosts and these crucifixes, almost something that's it's a distant memory in many ways. It's interesting that this is the time when not just Bram Stoker's writing about this, but that someone like Count Dracula could come in. Because before you'd still have the memory, the people would still think, okay, so we remember that crucifixes worked for this kind of thing. We remember that hosts worked for this kind of thing. And it's only then in the late 1800s where someone like Count Dracula could come in London and wreak havoc.
I think that's quite right. It's precisely because the memory of the vampire has disappeared, and in a way, the right, but also on the flip side, the rites of the medieval, the rituals, the way of life, the way of seeing the world is gone. That such a being can infiltrate, because there is no good or evil fundamentally. There is just profit, and there is just scientific truth, and within that, there's no category for a demonic being who's going to drink your blood in your sleep. There is just there is no place for it, and so essentially, I think you're right that it's. But in a way, what's interesting in Victorian literature, a lot of Victorian literature, is you do see a number of people who are in their guts. They're bringing forth in their intuitions, in their art, the memory of the old world. So you see this something like Dracula, but the flip side would be something like Arthurian poetry and painting. So Tennyson's Idylls of the Kings, the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, then painting lots of paintings about courtly knights and romance, and bringing back that sense of the England which they felt had been lost or eroded by industrialization and modernity. Well, not, I guess modernity might be the wrong word, but industrialization and the kind of collapse of traditional culture, and seeing actually, no, it's still within us. It still resides there, and we're going to give expression to it as it fades, and it kind of bursts forth. You can't control it. We can't help but express it, and literature seems to be one vehicle for that. And I guess the biggest example that I could think of would be somebody like Richard Wagner's work. The Ring Cycle, for example. The whole idea is reawakening the German spirit by representing it with the kind of stories that go back to its fundamental core or origins, to reawaken those things within the person who watches the Ring Cycle. And in a way, perhaps those who read Dracula, it's a reawakening experience too. It's actually representing to us the reality that maybe we've switched off from.
Yeah, I think there is definitely something to that. There's something that you read back through it and you can feel that there's something in there that, and you know it's there, but you know that you haven't been taught it, and you know that it's kind of been a little bit lost, and you feel like when you're reading Dracula, you're kind of rediscovering it. Because it's definitely, there's things missing from modern life that are very much present in Dracula, and there's things that are present in Dracula that have continued in the background of modernity. They're still there in the background, but we're just kind of blinded to them. We're a bit like we are all Jonathan Harker, the businessmen, just going about our business, oblivious to the fact that these monsters are sitting in the background, watching us and waiting and thinking, ooh, you'd make a very tasty meal.
The Jonathan Harkers have taken over.
Yes, yes, you can very much see that the Jonathan Harkers have taken over our world, and I think it's high time for them to face up to the things lurking in the dark that are waiting to eat them.
I did appreciate how they depicted his castle and how desolate that area was, because it seemed like people in that area had held on to some of that memory. They do have crucifixes around them, and they ostracize him. He's pretty much kept in his castle. No one goes in that area apart from the gypsies.
Yes,
who he uses.
That's very much it. He is cut off from the wider community, and the only community that will interact with him are outsiders, effectively.
Naive outsiders who don't know who he is. He's just a stranger to them, and they don't know his nature because they've lost their story.
Yeah,
that's very true. That's very true, and speaks to maybe also the desolate nature of being a vampire. You know, it's presented in our current culture as a very cool thing, and I kind of played into that a little bit earlier on when I said I prefer the vampiric disease, but it's like swish. You know, you wear a nice aristocratic clothing. You know, usually vampires are relatively handsome, although like Count Dracula in this is not supposed to be very handsome at all.
until halfway through the book when he starts to change.
Yes, well,
which again is like there's definitely some symbology in there.
And then, but actually, as we were mentioning earlier, it's a cursed life.
Yes,
and it's one that actually somebody like Dracula, when he dies, he wants to escape from. And I just wanted to comment on one thing that we haven't touched on, but it's an interesting kind of parallel which Stoker draws in the nature of the relationship to blood, because as we know, Dracula, what does he do? He takes others' blood, and like Renfield, he devours. He sucks out the life of another to gorge on it and to feed his own life, thus making him younger or more powerful, expanding his own powers. But essentially, it's a pillaging effect, which is ultimately parasitic and detrimental to all of life. In terms of if you extended the logic of like Dracula to its logical endpoint, eventually there would be no humans left, and he'd
have eaten them all.
He would have eaten them all, and it just, what did they do then? Just like go around hissing at each other, essentially. And as a part of that as well, he obviously doesn't have like a deep affection for the vampire ladies he's turned. They actually have a kind of very hostile relationship with one another. They fight over who's going to drink Harker's blood at one point, right?
Yeah.
And there's a hierarchy even for them.
Yeah.
He's the top one, and he banishes them.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's very much alpha in charge of the entire group.
Whereas, if you look at the heroes, one of the interesting things with Lucy is at first they don't really know what's going on with her, but they realize she's losing a lot of blood. We know it's because Dracula's drinking her blood, but
yes,
we can infer that at least at a very early stage, but they don't know that. So all these men who love her, over the course of several days, donate most of their blood to keep her alive. So you have her fiance Arthur Lord Godalming gives his blood, but then he's too weak to do it the next day. So I think it's Quincy Morris who does it.
Yeah.
John Seward does it, and I think even Van Helsing at one point gives his blood as well. And then, you know, a similar thing happens, I think, with Mina at one point too, that she's losing blood, so they start having to give her their blood. And so there's this very different relationship where actually the giving of blood, as opposed to taking it, is a form of love, and it brings life. It keeps life going. It actually flourishes. It allows Lucy to survive a lot longer than she would otherwise in this world. And so I think in a way, and of course those groups have a deep affection and bond with each other. There's really no conflict amongst them. They are of one purpose and they care for each other very deeply. And it's that bond actually which I think helps them overcome Dracula. So in many ways, what he's touching on is a very deep comment, which I think somebody like Wagner with the Ring Cycle also portrays. Is that actually the way of reality, fundamentally, if we're talking in religious terms, is love. The love of God, of course. God is love in Christianity, being the Trinity, that Christ dies for us. He sheds his blood for us so that our sins may be forgiven, and this brings us new life, and so on. As opposed to the Draculas who take, and this is manifested primarily in the form of taking and drinking blood. This is the fundamental conflict and the ways of life. And one brings life and one brings joy, and the other is a miserable existence, which even those who are in it, though they cannot escape from it, though they in some ways embrace it, fundamentally are victims of too. They are, by the end, even if Dracula was the most powerful being in the world, he is still pathetic in many ways. Sorry, that was a long.
No, that was
kind of comment.
I think it was really good. And jumping on from him being pathetic, I think one of the interesting things towards the end of the book is when they're chasing him, they keep on describing him as childlike in terms of his actions, which I found quite an interesting sort of thing. It's like they basically say he's acting selfishly and like a petulant child, effectively, and his actions become predictable to them because as he's panicking, he sort of degenerates. His plans fall apart more and more as they've sort of coalesced into this one unit where they're a synchronous group acting on a single purpose. He's just getting more and more panicked and more flustered, trying to get away from them.
Because he's a slave to his needs, actually.
Yes.
Whereas the opposite is true of the group. They choose to fight for each other.
Yeah.
They're not a slave to each other. They're not a slave to their emotions or their animal instincts. They're choosing to fight for each other. And that's why I wrote a little question here in my notes. I thought, what did it require to defeat him in the end? In the end, what it was that defeated him was a man who knows his history, Van Helsing, and who brings together a group of generally elite people and motivated by their love for each other and are willing to sacrifice themselves like Quincy did for Mina.
Yeah.
That's what it took to defeat the Count.
That's absolutely it. I think at the end of the story, it is literally basically a group of men stood over a child, effectively. Just for all he's 1,000, he's hundreds of years old, he's acting with the mentality of a child, and they are very much clearly represented as men.
I think those are great points, and in a way, perhaps it's a pointer for us moving forward as well as both as us three here, but also those listening, in terms of actually how we go about things. Many of us want to see change, and there's lots of people who promise us change and offer us change. And of course, we're talking a few days after the American election, where there's a lot of hype about these sorts of things. But actually, what's kind of being presented here is it's not like a political program or a policy. It's actually a certain moral character combined with a brotherhood, almost.
Yeah.
A kind of knightly order, you might say. And in many ways, you could see the heroes by the end as like the Knights Templar going off to fight against Dracula, the Antichrist sort of figure here. And so maybe it's about how do you form those connections? And it's particularly striking as well because I don't know about you guys, but I was thinking, you know, 3 of these men proposed to the same woman. She rejected 2 of them, and one of them was accepted. And of course, that was very painful. But there's no question in their hearts of jealousy or like, oh, we're, you know, resentment. They're brothers and they're friends, and they keep good faith with each other to the point where
Yeah.
Quincy gives up his own life. Like it's quite moving when you think about it.
And they take the castle back at the end.
That's right.
Van Helsing takes the locks and makes sure that they can't get locked in, and he takes over the castle. That's one of the last chapters.
The purification of the castle.
Mm-hmm.
The cleansing. Yes.
There we go.
So let's see. A number of people have been commenting on your channel, James, on Sino Lit. Do you want to say anything to them?
Yeah, well, I've been doing this for this channel called Sinolit for the last year or so, seriously. Before that, I didn't even have a mic or a proper camera. And I've been documenting Chinese literature, history, and there are many parallels to our times. Many, many parallels. I've done a few interviews with academics on there where I've actually got them to say and admit to pretty surprising things on video. So yeah, I've been working at that, and that's one of my passions outside of my work. And yeah, so yeah, I really enjoy doing that. And it would surprise viewers, I think, just to what extent there are parallels with Chinese history. Many, many parallels, particularly with regard to the fall of the Ming and the subsequent Qing dynasty. Many, many, many parallels. So yeah, if anyone's curious about that, there's a video up there with an interview with Dr. Lynn Struve very recently, where we go over that. And yeah, there too many parallels to name and count
I think
here.
I might have to go have a look at that after this, because reading Jurassic Park, one of the things that it's very interested in is fractals and chaos theory. And one of the things that I'm of the opinion of is that cyclical history is very much a thing. I think history does just run in cycles. And on the fractal side of things and chaos theory, you could very, very easily say, right, I'm just going to zoom out the picture as much as I can to look at all empires across time. And then when I zoom in on the little pictures of each of the individual empires, oh, wow, it's all the same shape that goes the same way every time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, I think speaking from experience, one of the things is that there's so much baggage that we can have on us because we're in our own story. And then studying another empire with a very different history can make the situation where we are now very clear indeed.
Yeah.
It gives you a distance from the actual material. Then you can see the patterns more clearly, and then you feed them back in, I guess, into this situation, right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think it gives you that ability to sort of, like you say, you're looking at it over there, and then once you've looked at it over there, you can kind of climb up a ladder and look at where you were stood and say, oh, these look very similar.
I mean, in a way, I think something like literature like Dracula also has the same effect to a certain degree. Yeah. It's not quite as sharp because, as you and I, James, were saying earlier, when we were younger, we didn't spot a lot of these things in the story. Now, that might just be because we were younger and we didn't have as much life experience, or literally in terms of brain development. Like I was many years off my brain being fully developed biologically. But nonetheless, like it was, there's still an opportunity through a story to see things differently than just in the present moment, because it represents it through a vampire, right? I think something like The Lord of the Rings is very compelling because it does that too, especially with something like trees. Tolkien loves his trees, right? And everywhere's got trees. I was thinking about this the other day. It's like the Shire has the party tree, Lothlorien has its Malon trees, the silver trees, Gondor has the white tree. There's talking trees, there's trees which try to eat you. There's every kind of tree you could possibly want. But it then therefore presents to us trees in a new way, that, or actually in the old way, but reacquaints us with them as living beings.
Yeah,
So go ahead.
we don't really think of trees as having a story. We just kind of look at them as inanimate objects and go, oh yeah, it's a tree. But yeah, no, I think Tolkien does an excellent job of pointing out, like, oh no, there's more to it. Especially when you look into the sort of old-fashioned things and more traditional aspects of the ways that we would have interacted with nature and the world, we understood that there was more of a story to it than the pure material that we tend to just glaze over everything with and say, nah, it's all just objects. Where it's like, no, there is more to it. There is that story there, and you have to go out and rediscover it. And I think Tolkien does an excellent job of kind of priming you and pointing you towards trying to rediscover the stories.
Absolutely. And so I think also then looking at other civilizations like you're doing, James, is fantastic work for that very same reason. And indeed, perhaps it's even sharper than because it's so different. And as Vingle kind of points out in the chat, and hello to you, Vingle, good to see you. Good to see you, my good friend. Many of the concepts are different, or the starting philosophy is different, or at least it appears that way on the surface. So then it has a different feel. It's like a goldfish, looking from in its bowl and then being dropped in another bowl but it's actually not a bowl anymore. It's a rectangular fish tank, and it's like, okay, I need to find my way in this very different civilization now, with its different tradition and history and religion. And then you can see those patterns back. So yeah, everyone should go and watch James's channel. I think that's what the last 10 minutes has kind of convinced everyone of.
Yes, definitely.
At least if to see what the academics actually admitted to. I couldn't believe what I got them to say. It was I had never imagined that they would
I'm fascinated now.
admit to what they admitted to.
I need to go watch your channel after this, because
there are two interviews. There are two interviews up there. One with James, the biographer of James Legge, who was the great Scottish translator of all of the Chinese classics, and I interviewed his biographer, Dr. Marilyn Bowman. James Legge, very much of a similar time period to Bram Stoker.
Right.
That was about a year ago, and then recently the Ming Dynasty scholar, and some very interesting little pills in there.
Right. Have to go and take them all.
Well, we've probably got about a couple of minutes left. So, any closing words on Count Dracula? James, go ahead.
I'd one little brief question. I had a little theory on this, and I wanted to ask you what you think.
Go for it.
We've talked a lot about the context of Jonathan Harker and why he is the way he is, but what do you think is specifically about him? Do you think there's anything specifically about him which made him so naive or unable to see and sense what he was seeing?
I'm not sure that there's anything. I'm not sure that there is anything specific about him. I think he's meant to be a representation of the sort of everyman of the kind of British Empire at that point. He's meant to represent that middle class that would go out and do that and just would completely not understand, because they've lost that tool set. And it's not just that one person happened to have an insufficient tool set. It is
as a civilization at that point, I think they were aware that yes, this tool set is gone from beyond our reach. And it's not just that one person has got a faulty tool set, it's that literally it's left the cultural knowledge.
I mean, I agree with you in the main. I guess I would just add, I think he's a very agreeable person, at least in the beginning. You know, as you've mentioned, he tries to acquiesce at every turn to help Dracula, and he doesn't raise any issues with him. You know, he doesn't complain. He doesn't say, "Oh, there's an issue. Can you sort this out?" He's just kind of, "Well, I don't want to jeopardize the deal." Whereas somebody more disagreeable would certainly, you know, not be doing all of that. And perhaps there's also, see, when you were saying this, I was reminded of is it in London? They're trying to get access to the house, and he goes to deal with the estate agents who will have the keys. And he meets a fellow there who, you know, he's all very by the book, but when he hears Lord Godalming is interested, suddenly it's, let me get the red carpet out, and I will do everything I can to help you. And although Harker is not quite as bad as this character in terms of his morality at the beginning, it does seem like perhaps he's seeing a reflection of himself or his former self, and he doesn't seem to have much truck with this character and doesn't really respect him in any way. So perhaps there was a bit of clinging on to trying to seem good or get the favor of those who have power may have been something which drew him in, because certainly that guy that he meets in London would have been over at Castle Dracula too in a heartbeat if he had the chance. Well, what do you think, James?
Well, I think there's some clues in the text, very, very cleverly sort of showing, not telling, by Bram Stoker. Here's one I found. So he's recalling his experience in the castle in his diary at the beginning. And then he says, I wonder if this is a customary incident in the life of a solicitor's clerk sent out to explain the purchase of a London estate to a foreigner. Solicitor's clerk, he says. Mina would not like that. Solicitor. For just before leaving London, I got word that my examination was successful, and I am now a full-blown solicitor. I begin to rub my eyes and punch myself to see if I were awake. It all seemed like a dream. There's this arrogance to him. You know, he's sort of got this self-love. He's like, oh, I'm a solicitor now. I'm going off on my first foreign business trip. I'm important. I think there's a definite arrogance to Harker and a sort of self-love. He's very proud of the fact that he's a solicitor.
Yeah,
I think that makes him blind to all his senses because he just loves himself.
That's a great point, and I would tie that into in Arthurian literature. You know, one of the great stories is about the Holy Grail, and there's different versions of the Grail story, but one of the main ones from the Lancelot Grail cycle, Lancelot, because of his adultery, is unable to respond to the Grail as he should. He's left in a slumber, and it's only through a process of repentance that he's able to finally even approach the Grail and give it adoration as he should do. And there's this kind of suggestion then that actually a man's vices will blind him from reality, including spiritual reality. In Lancelot's case, he literally cannot wake up in the presence of the Grail. He is dead to it, essentially, until he is reformed, until the Holy Spirit has turned him inside out and brought him on the path of faith and repentance. And I think what you're saying there with Harker corresponds with that. He cannot see because he is blinded by his vice. And I mean, this is very alien to a modern way of thinking, but in a sense, this kind of idea, it's that you literally don't have the ability to see because of these flaws but they're deeper than flaws. It's almost like gouging out your eye and then thinking you'll be able to see properly.
Yeah,
It's almost like that.
That your explanation has made us think it's literally pride goes before the fall, and it is very much the sin. Jonathan Harker has committed the sin of pride, and he is then brought down as heavily as can be brought down.
That's true.
He really pays a big fine for that, doesn't he? I mean,
Yeah.
crikey, his wife gets nearly turned into a vampire. His best friends lose their wife. It's awful, the pain that he goes through. But does he deserve it in a way?
Yeah.
Well,
By his blindness, by his negligence.
That is a great question to leave this on. I think I don't think any more needs to be added. I think that's the perfect question to the audience, and I would encourage everyone to put your comments below, because I think we'd all be very interested to see what people say and to engage further. But with that, we are in the small hours. We're getting towards the small hours when dark creatures leave their tombs. So maybe we should all depart for the night, seek refuge. Thank you to you both. It's been a real pleasure, and I've thoroughly enjoyed this. And I feel like I have a deeper sense of the book than I did before the stream.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
it's got my mind racing with lots of things to think about, and I'm very much looking forward to our next stream in a month's time or so.
Yeah, should be good.
Grand. Have a good evening, everyone. Have a good evening, Nathan. Thank you.
Yeah.
And
Thank you, guys.
Have a lovely evening.
Cheers. Good night.
And thank you all in the audience. Good night for now.